You're listening to ThunderQuack Podcast Network.
All right, we're back for Friday night on the ThunderQuack Podcast Quarantine Zone. The ThunderQuack Podcast is the official podcast of ThunderQuack.com for those who maybe don't know. And you can get the ThunderQuack Podcast every Tuesday. You can get it early every Tuesday on patreon.com/ThunderQuack, or you can wait and get it late every Friday on podcast services across the galaxy. But tonight we're doing another live stream, and I've got a special guest that I'm very excited about from the Wampa's lair. We've got Karl Laclair. Hey, Karl, how's it going?
Hey, buddy, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you in here. We're going to talk about some Star Wars tonight.
I suppose you can pull my arm into doing that.
Awesome. For those who don't know, Karl hosts a podcast with a voice that you actually heard right at the beginning of this live stream with Jason Hunt, who does our ThunderQuack intro. He actually does a lot of the intros on the ThunderQuack Podcast Network because he is a prolific, illustrious voice performer, actor, person. And he's been doing a lot of audiobooks lately, which is really cool. But we had him first. ThunderQuack had him first, and we've got him. He's all over the place. But Karl, you're the other half of the Wampa's Lair podcast, or I guess you guys are a triad in the Force now, right?
No longer a triad. And we're
okay. You're back to a dyad. You were a triad for a minute, and now you're back to a dyad. It's all good.
Yeah.
But you've been talking about Star Wars on the internet for as long as I've known you, basically. Which at this point is a long time. It's when did we meet? 2012, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Star Wars Celebration 6.
Yep.
Yeah.
Celebration 6 in Orlando.
Yeah.
Just some time. That was a great time.
And I remember when you walked up at first, I was like, "Who is this guy?" He's just like talking to us like he's friends with all of us. And then I learned like, oh, he does a podcast with Jason. Then I was like, oh, he seems like a pretty cool guy. And then we had our that night in the hotel suite, which sounds lascivious, but there was more than just Karl and I there, which I guess that only makes it sound worse. But we Crystal and I ended up with a crazy awesome hotel suite because there were ants in our hotel room. The first night, so they ended up moving us into this really, really awesome suite, and we were right across from the convention center, so everybody ended up back at our place, and we just had a fun night of sitting around, just kind of shooting the breeze with the whole crew, and it was, I think it was that evening that I was like, this Karl guy's a pretty good guy. I think I like this guy a lot. And then the next celebration, we got a house. We all got a house together. So
yeah, that was iconic.
Yeah. So
celebrating Force Awakens.
Yeah,
that was great.
So that was the last time that we saw each other in person was at the beginning of the sequel trilogy, and here we are now chatting, and the sequel trilogy has come to a close, and there's a lot of mixed feelings out there about the sequel trilogy. I know the answer to this because I just listened to your podcast the other day, but let's pretend like I don't, and I'll ask. Where do you fall? How do you feel about the sequels?
Yeah, my honest assessment is I enjoyed them all, for sure. I mean, Last Jedi initially I really had a hard time getting my head around it. I've really come to love that movie, though. I think it's the most brilliant of the sequel trilogy. The way it kind of pushes new ground. But Rise of Skywalker was by far my favorite. I had the most fun with that one. But I'll say this: at the end of the day, they're good, fun Star Wars movies, but insofar as completing the Skywalker saga, I put it as an asterisk. Like, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't move anything forward. It's the same. So in that regard, I think it's that's where it falls short in my book. And it's not to say that I don't like them or I think they're bad movies. But I think, with the way, whenever I watch episode 9, I'm like, wow, that was such a great story. But then when I think about how it connects to the other 2 movies, I'm like, I don't know. Like, right. It's a lot of the same complaints we've heard a million times, right? Like that they needed a stronger creative force behind everything, which I think is true. I don't blame either director, though. I think JJ and Ryan both did phenomenal work with what was available to them. If any of the blame is to fall, it's on Bob Iger. No doubt about it. And Disney's execs, where they think more about money signs than they do about telling a good story, which is fair. It's a company. But yeah, I really enjoyed the sequel trilogy insofar that it gave the Star Wars mythology to a new generation, and that's really important. I work with like college students, I've worked with younger people, and they've latched onto it. This is their Star Wars, in the same way that we grew up with the originals, or other people grew up with the prequels.
Yeah.
So I think in that regard, it was a great success. They're really fun Star Wars stories. They they gave us fun new things to think about and to talk about for years to come, which I'm super excited about. But yeah, I think, and that's like, to me, what kind of episode 8, Last Jedi, I think really pushed the envelope insofar as, all right, we've got this great Star Wars myth. Let's do something new with it. And then episode 9 just said, no, like, let's just have it as the comfort food it's always been. So, and I'm not saying that in a disparaging way. Like I said, I prefer 9 to 8, but I think 8 opened the door to something new, and 9 just kind of stayed in the comfy seat. So in that regard, like, when I finish the sequel trilogy as a whole, it's like, I don't think we need this story as a fulfillment of what happened in 1 through 6. Like, I still see Return of the Jedi as the end of the Skywalker saga, and then there's like this fun asterisk that you can watch for fun. So that's kind of how I fall with it. I think with anything, right, like, you've got to give it the test of time, right? You and I have, we grew up with the original trilogy, and then the prequels have been with us for 20 years now. So that longevity, I think, will also have something to say about it. That being said, I mean, Force Awakens, only 4, going on 5 years old is all. I never watched that movie anymore. Like, it was fun. I had a great time in 2015 when it came out. But I rarely go back and watch it. I've watched episode 8 a lot more in the last year than I did the first year it came out, just because I really have come to love it so much more in light of episode 9. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're really good stories. I think, so that's where I kind of land on it. But I don't really, I know you liked it as well, but I'm curious what your kind of overall opinion is on it.
Yeah. So my relationship with The Rise of Skywalker in particular is it's topsy-turvy. It's a, you know what, I've in the past referred to the relationship with Star Wars as a bit of an abusive relationship, and I usually am talking about other people, but because like, so I'll explain that. That sounds like a lot when you just drop it like that. There's a dynamic with a lot of people who grew up with the original trilogy, where they really, really hold those movies in high esteem. And for good reason, because they're 3 of the greatest movies ever made. But then the prequels come out, and the prequels are a very different thing. They're not the same type of films as the original trilogy. And it's actually really similar to, there's the first 3 Indiana Jones movies, and even within that, I would say that, like, Temple kind of feels weird in those 3 movies, although it's my favorite. And then there's Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which is a completely other thing. And it's much more noticeable in that because we have more historical touch points, like real historical touch points, where you can see, like, Last Crusade and Raiders are very similar because they both take place during World War II. Temple of Doom, technically in the timeline, and this is retcon, but technically it's before Raiders of the Lost Ark. It actually takes place before the war starts. And which is why there's kind of no focus on a thematic villain. It's very much the story of what is happening there, and there are broader themes, but they don't kind of tie into a historical context, or they especially don't bring in the Judeo-Christian mythology. Which saying mythology is going to make some people bristle, but we're talking about the Holy Grail and the Ark, which are in the way that they're treated in Raiders of the Lost Ark, they're treated as mythical objects. And then we get to but those are very serialized, like pulp adventures from the 1930s and 40s, right? And then we jump ahead to Crystal Skull, and Crystal Skull is not that. Crystal Skull is a B movie from the 1950s and 60s, right? It's them, which is the one about the giant ants. That's why there's a whole sequence with fire ants in it. There's also, they're red fire ants. They're actually thematically linked into communist Russia, right? Like, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is a boring movie. I will not defend it on that. It drags like crazy throughout that film. It's really difficult to sit through and watch. But in terms of the way that the screenplay is written and the thematic ideas that are in it, I love it. It's exactly like the prequels, to bring it all the way back to Star Wars. The original trilogy are Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, Edgar Rice Burroughs, serialized science fiction fantasy storytelling, right? The prequels are Renaissance. They're actually they're meant to be epic poems and like Shakespeare. Those are the inspirations for the storytelling there, which is why there's way less of a focus on individual characters. There's way less of a focus on the sort of the Campbellian myth aspect of it, which is much more of like a Western ideology of storytelling, and it's a lot more, they're historical epics in the same way that Shakespeare wrote a lot of historical epics, and like I said, like sort of epic poetry and stuff like that, right? So people who don't understand that that's what George Lucas was going for are going to have a really hard time with it, in the same way that ninth graders have a really hard time with Shakespeare, where it's like, well, I don't understand what anybody's talking about. And it's like, well, you're not supposed to really understand what they're talking about. It doesn't really matter. You're supposed to be like, don't listen to the words, listen to the inflection, listen to the subtext of it, and do a little bit of homework, do a little bit of extra lifting, and you'll actually find that there's a lot of substance underneath that. Now, the majority of the audience doesn't follow that. And why would they? Because it's not explicitly stated at any point in time. There's nothing overtly Shakespearean about it, other than the one big clue that there is in the prequel trilogy that makes me 100% confident in this assessment of it is the love theme between Anakin and Padme. It's titled Across the Stars, which is just a flip of Star-Crossed, which is like Romeo and Juliet. They are Romeo and Juliet. They're destined for tragedy, right? Like their romance is not really romance. It's infatuation with one another, and it's gonna end poorly with both of them dead. And that's basically what happens. It's right there in the title to that love theme. So I get that, I see that, but I am both a Star Wars nerd and a Shakespeare nerd. So I'm going to put those two things together. The majority of people don't see that. And to go back to the whole abusive relationship thing, Star Wars, it's that thing of like, when you were a kid, Star Wars always treated you good, right? Star Wars was always good. Star Wars took you out to McDonald's and got you a Happy Meal. So everything was okay because that's what you remember. And then when you were older, you started to realize, actually, Star Wars said a lot of things to me, kind of put me down, and didn't really support me when I needed it to. And like, so you go back and you start to look back at it and you go like, wait a second, are those 3 movies as perfect as I think they are? Do they make as much sense as I think they do? Have I just been kind of glossing over some of this stuff? So it's one of those things that when you're in an abusive relationship, it's really hard to see it until like you have that kind of eureka moment of like, oh wait, this person, and when I say abusive, I don't mean like physical, like somebody hitting somebody. I just mean like if you have a friend that always treats you like crap and they're just like, you're a punching bag to them. And then you realize eventually like, oh, this person is not actually my friend. Like they are literally just using me. I'm here to fulfill a purpose in their life and they don't really care about me. There's an aspect of that that's very similar to, I think, a lot of people's relationship with Star Wars. I think it's one of the things that we're seeing online right now with a lot of people's reactions is that you've got kids who grew up with the prequels and then later came to enjoy the original trilogy as well. And now those kids are adults now, right? In the same way that we became adults during the prequels. And they're looking at these sequels and going like, this isn't what I thought Star Wars was. I thought Star Wars was this thing that I remember from when I was a kid. And they watch the prequels and the original trilogy, and it's all nostalgia, the whole thing, including Clone Wars now, right? Like, that's all nostalgia. And then when you experience it in real time, you don't have nostalgia for The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker. The Force Awakens has some manufactured nostalgia in it, right? Like just by its nature of having like the Millennium Falcon coming back and all of the classic characters and stuff like that. The Last Jedi, I think one of the reasons why it ruffled so many feathers is because of how different it was, and because in fact it didn't have the same nostalgia. For me, I personally, The Last Jedi is my favorite saga film. So I'm kind of past that. I love Rian Johnson as a filmmaker. Like all of his movies that I've seen, the only one I haven't seen is Brick. But everything else, like I love his stuff. I think that he is a genius. Knives Out is one of the best movies of last year. Like that movie is so genius and so fun and so meticulously crafted, as what like Looper was as well. And to me, like he's only gotten better with every movie that he makes. He kind of ups himself and invites new challenges and stuff like that. And I think that like there's a lot of things in the Last Jedi that a lot of people, I think, go like, well, that was dumb. That doesn't make sense. That seems like a mistake. He didn't think that through. And having studied some of his other movies, I'm like, there's nothing in those movies that he didn't think through. Everything is there for a reason. It's absolutely the same as I'll say for the prequels. If the audience in general doesn't get all of that stuff, then as a filmmaker, you've kind of whiffed the ball a little bit. But that doesn't mean that they, like, I don't think that makes him a filmmaker. I also don't think that George Lucas is a bad filmmaker. I think that they are focused on different things. I think that George Lucas is focused on technology. I think he's focused on scope and magnitude, and the small stuff, it kind of slips through the cracks with him. I think that Rian Johnson was so focused on breaking Star Wars out of the Campbellian monomyth, because of the fact, like, and everything that Rian Johnson did, I think he did as a response to what JJ had put in The Force Awakens. And I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind, is that, like, when you watch the director and the Jedi and you listen to him talk about it, it's not about like you had this clip in that episode that you did recently where he says, like, I had to justify why Luke Skywalker would turn his back on the galaxy, right? He's dealt a hand and then he has to play it, but it's not his hand. It was somebody else's hand, but he still has to play it, and he has to play it the best way that he knows how. And that's what he did. And he was handed the main character, this protagonist of Rey, and not given the full scope of what was going on with that character, which is a huge mistake. Like that is the central piece that is missing that connects all three movies. JJ did one thing and apparently had an idea. If you listen to what he says in The Rise of Skywalker, the Skywalker Legacy documentary, I think he's full of it. I don't think that he really, in The Force Awakens, knew where he wanted it to go by the third movie. I think that he was creating a mystery box, which he always does. That's just his deal. But I think that like the core of that was, okay, here's Rey, and he goes, okay, well this is our protagonist. She's not Luke Skywalker, because we've already seen Luke Skywalker, and in fact we've seen Luke Skywalker twice, because we saw Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy, and we got hints during the original trilogy of like, hey, you're following in your father's footsteps, don't make the mistakes that he did. And then 20 odd years later, George Lucas goes, okay, here's the mistakes that he made, and tells the story of Luke Skywalker again from a different point of view. But instead of it being the hero's journey, it's a villain's journey. So I think Rian Johnson looked at it and, okay, we can't just do the hero's journey again. A, because it's already been done now twice. It's been done and then inverted. And I think that he looked at it and went, it's like Rey. It's right there. The answer is right in front of you. It's a heroine's journey, right? I can't get too deep into that stuff because I'm still studying that. I'm still trying to learn what that means and understand the feminine gaze and all of these things that I think that Rian Johnson actually knows really, really well and puts in the Last Jedi in a very impactful way. And it's only been in talking about Star Wars with female fans that I've started to realize there's a whole other aspect to these movies that I haven't been privy to, because I'm using my male lens to view it, right?
Yeah.
And now that I'm stepping outside of that, and to be honest, it's because I screwed up. I messed up and jumped into a conversation and said some things that I shouldn't have said to the Reylo community, not realizing what I was saying, right? Not coming from a bad place, but just like using my perspective, right? And my perspective was inherently harmful in that conversation, and I didn't realize that until after I'd already stepped in it. Caused a whole kerfuffle, got just roasted by this community, and really shown that I was out of my depth and I didn't have any business entering into the conversation in the way that I did, and that I needed to do a lot more observing before talking, a lot more listening instead of speaking. But now that I've done, I would say a good chunk of that, and having one-on-one conversations as opposed to a conversation with somebody I didn't know, and be sort of inviting the entire community to be a part of that. But instead having these one-on-one conversations with a few friends that I made out of that situation, I'm starting to not just realize that there's this whole other aspect to, in particular, the sequel trilogy and Rey and Kylo Ren's story, but that actually it should be 100% central to the story. It should be a lot more clear than it is, and I love the tidbits of it that we do get, like these little sort of snippets. And in learning that I actually love that, and then because I love it now, digging deeper into it, beginning to understand that I don't think that J.J. Abrams was putting this stuff in the first film on purpose. I think that there's some happenstance. I think there's some serendipity there. I think that Adam Driver made a few decisions that pushed it in this direction. And I think that Rian Johnson picked up on that stuff. And then he took it and cranked that knob to 11, to the point that there's what must be a Pride and Prejudice reference in The Last Jedi when we see Kylo Ren shirtless, which is this total flip of the way that we are used to viewing film. And I think for a lot of guys in that movie, it was like, whoa, what is this? And we have the same reaction that Rey does of like, could you please put something on? But it's actually like that romantic angle is so important to what Rian Johnson was trying to establish between these two characters. And I didn't get that. I totally missed all of that subtext because I wasn't viewed that way. Now that I have it post Rise of Skywalker, I go back and revisit the whole thing, and it's like, oh, this is what this trilogy was about. It was about something completely different, and I was viewing it wrong, incorrectly. And now when I view it, I'm like, okay, I think I'm starting to get it. Now I understand why there's a lot of female fans, not even female fans, but feminine fans that are not happy with the way that this story turned out. And initially I was like, Ben Solo dies. That the narrative structure of Western storytelling tells us that he has to die. He's murdered people. That's a cardinal sin. And in screenwriting, that's what happens. If you murder somebody, there's no coming back from it. You don't just get to like redeem yourself by doing a nice thing. And like in order to make up for that cardinal sin, you have to commit the ultimate sacrifice, right? Like that's how the monomyth is supposed to work. It's what happens with Vader. Why would we want what happened with Vader to happen again? And also, it's not that type of story. And both Rey and Ben Solo at the end of that story kind of deserve to have an opportunity to be with another person who understands them. So instead of getting that, Ben Solo dies and Rey is alone. She's just alone at the end of the movie. And although she's found her family and all of that stuff, and those themes are there, finding your family is very different from finding a person who truly understands what you've been through and who you are inside, right? Like that's a partner, not a found family, right? These are different things. And I love the themes of found family in Star Wars, particularly in the sequel trilogy. The moment at the end where they all hug is a great moment. It's so well executed and the performances are off the charts. But then we get the coda at the end of the movie that is just like Rey off by herself with BB-8, and Ben Solo's ghost doesn't even show up to that party. Anakin Skywalker is not there. It's like, it's such a sour taste in my mouth, and it's every time I watch the movie, I watch through that whole movie and I'm like, this is fun, this is exciting, I don't know what my problem is, I'm being so silly about all of this. And then we get to the end, and actually the turning point is when Kylo Ren says, you have his power, right? And it's like, just takes everything away from Rey. And that's not the character doing that. That was the screenwriters doing it, of saying like, oh no, everybody, she's not a nobody, she's a Palpatine. I know you guys needed an explanation for why a woman can have power. It's because of Emperor Palpatine. Oh, thank God, it connects to the other 6 movies. And then they kind of wipe their hands, and the rest of the movie is just Palpatine monologuing, and none of the other characters really get to do much of anything, except like Ben has a good moment of showing up to the rescue. Like there are cool things in there, but it falls so short of, I think, what it needs to be in order to finish their story. Instead of it finishing Rey and Finn and Poe and Kylo's story, it finishes Palpatine's story, which was finished. Nobody was asking for an end to Palpatine's story. And yet the last half of that movie, that's all it is. That's all it's about. It's everything revolves around Palpatine. And Poe Dameron just circles the battlefield for half an hour. He doesn't do anything in that fight. And that just tragic to me. Like, that's just the worst thing you can do with that character, is that he goes through everything he goes through in these 3 movies, and he comes out the other end and he's like, you're the general now. And he's in the fight, and partway through the fight, he goes, guys, this is really hard. I give up. And then Lando shows up to be like, don't give up. And it's like, no, it should have been Poe's moment. It should have been Poe's moment. Captain America doesn't stop at the end of Endgame and go like, Thanos, you beat me. And then everybody shows up. He's being beaten, and he stands up and without saying it says, I can do this all day. And then everybody shows up and says, it's okay, we got your back. And that's what the moment should be. And it's so annoying that we got what it should be in a different movie to compare it to, but I did a whole Twitter rant about that. I just talked for a really long time. Carl, react to what I just said.
Well, I mean, I love a lot of what you said. I disagree with some of what you said. I really push back against people that say Rey ends up alone at the end. That's not what it's about. So I get really annoyed by that take, because it's also given fire to a lot of hatred towards J.J. Abrams. So that's something I think is important to keep in mind, that there are a lot of fans out there that are acting just as belligerent as the Last Jedi haters.
Oh,
so
for sure.
I think it's important we don't sweep that under the rug.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you see these tweets where it's like, if I had 2 bullets in a gun with Hitler and whatever there, I'd put 2 in JJ. It's like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you're a horrible human. Like, it's a story. You didn't get over it. So, you're missing the point of Tatooine if you think it's about Rey being there alone. Now, is it a perfect ending? That's up for debate. Sure. I'm totally on board with you, Mike, about Ben Solo's ghost not being there. That's just stupid. There's no excuse for Ben not being there. But she's not going there to live there. I'd also push back that Rey and Kylo being romantic is a necessity. I don't think it's a necessity. I think the Force dyad is something that I'm fascinated by. I really wish they'd done more with that, either in the movie itself or, again, it'd been something that was set up in 7. But it's not. So, I think culturally we don't need another story about partners always being romantic. We've had enough of that too. So that's sometimes my pushback about Rey and Kylo needing to be romantic. It's also important to note that it shouldn't be Rey and Kylo. It should be Rey and Ben. Yeah. Right? She should never be the villain. So, I think that's important to point out as well. So that being said, I love that they have found each other's person in one another, but that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be romantic. So my interpretation, actually, and part of the reason I love that she takes the name Skywalker is, in a way, I see it as Rey saying she is Ben's stepsister or something. I got some pushback when I posted something about that myself on Twitter. People, and, obviously they kiss, and is the kiss romantic or not? I mean, I feel like it is, because you don't kiss someone on the mouth if it's just like a friend. I don't think. Yeah. I don't know.
No, that kiss is romantic, 100%. But yeah. Yeah,
but you're right. We've heard time and time again of whether or not it was even going to be in there. I think it's touching, and it is. I've come to really enjoy it in the moment. I think it is really touching and beautiful, but I think it also just, even if you just go the route of, they end up together, that's still a story trope we've heard a million times. And as someone who lives in a world without a romantic partner, to say that you need that, I think is a really shortchanging people of other relationships they can construct in life. So I was a big fan of them being each other's person in a new way, and we just went the easy way. We kissed, and then he dies. So yeah, it's kind of weak the way it falls apart like that. And again, that's why, I don't want to get super negative, because overall I do really enjoy the movie, but yeah, it falls short of everything that Episode 8 offered us. And I love to own the fact that I was about Episode 8. I really didn't care for it for the first few months it was out. I mean, there were moments I really enjoyed, and there's still a lot of moments I don't particularly like in Episode 8. Overall, and this is kind of something I was doing in this solo podcast I did the other day, which is essentially I looked at how JJ raised the question, a very good question for Episode 7, which is, why do we tell the Star Wars myth, right? That was kind of the question posed to all the creative minds. And then, like, you keep pointing out, Mike, like Ryan then takes that question and does something else. And I think Ryan attempts to answer it by saying, we take it in a new direction. We tell a new story, right? We don't recreate the monomyth. We don't recreate Joseph Campbell's story. We've heard that twice. We don't need it again. So Ryan kind of said, let's go somewhere new with it. And then again, it was handed back to JJ, and he just kind of, flopped us back down in the beanbag chair and said, hey, isn't this fun? And hell yeah, it's fun. But it didn't really complete the story, right? So that's, like, again, like I said, kind of at the top, like, that's why to me the sequel trilogy has now become an asterisk. And I'll, like, this is the reaction I had at my first viewing of Last Jedi and my reaction I had at my first viewing of Rise of Skywalker. I'll never forget. So I remember Last Jedi. I said to the group of friends I was with, I was like, wow, that was a phenomenal movie. I just don't know if it was a good Star Wars movie. Like, that was kind of what I had to figure out for myself for a long time, because again, it was a new kind of Star Wars movie. But what I said at the end of episode 9 the first time was, I was like, wow, that was a great fan film. Because it's kind of what it felt like, right? We got all the, like, old Empire beats and, like, all these fun legendary stories we grew up with. And we all thought we might have wanted, well, a lot of people were like, that's what I want to see on the big screen. Well, we kind of got it with episode 9, and I'm happy. I mean, I'm fine saying, like, yeah, I don't think that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Right. So that being said, it's still my favorite of the sequels. I enjoy it more than a lot of the Star Wars movies at this point. I have so much fun watching it, and I do love Rey in that movie so much. Yeah. I really, really love this character who's really struggling to figure out her identity. And I love that she takes the name Skywalker there, and I know a lot of people don't. And that's totally valid. And when she takes the name Skywalker, yes, she ultimately fails the heroine's journey. I mean, again, like you said about Kylo, she doesn't, but the screenwriters do. So, like, I think there's just a lot of missed opportunities with episode 9, but I feel like when I watch it on its own and just kind of enjoy it in that moment, I'm like, yeah, this is a really fun Star Wars movie. But taken as a whole, as a part of a trilogy, and taken as the final, chapter of the what's now a 9-part story, I don't think it cuts it in that regard. So, and I remember making that comment, like, after seeing it a few times, and by that point I was really enjoying it. But the thing that I just posed was, like, I feel like it's a really fun, good Star Wars movie, but it doesn't answer the question of why did we need the sequel trilogy, right? Yeah. So, like, and that's how I still just kind of stand with it. I mean, what we like to do in the Wamba's Lair anyway, like with the podcast, is we just like to focus on what we enjoy about all these movies. So we try our best not to be overly critical. I mean, usually when we do, like, our first initial reaction episodes, we obviously have some of our critiques in there. We try not to, spend too much energy on that, because there's enough of that crap on Twitter. Which is why I'm often taking Twitter breaks, because Star Wars Twitter fans I find to be some of the most obnoxious people in the world.
Yeah.
From both sides, to be completely honest. Like, I don't think either side is vindicated of that.
Yeah. Twitter has created this really weird phenomenon where, and it's not just Star Wars, I think it's in a lot of fandoms, where people just shout into the void, and then on occasion the void shouts back, and then the void gets into a shouting match with itself, and it's just it's so disconnected from reality, and people don't stop to look and realize that there's another human being on the other end of the keyboard, and they're just going at it. And it's different from Facebook, where, like, on Facebook, everybody you interact with on Facebook is either someone you've chosen to be friends with, or is friends with somebody that you know, right? For the most part. I mean, like, if you're in groups and stuff like that, then maybe you go outside of that. But just from its sort of inception, it's meant to be for, like, the people that you already know. So if you know another person, you're not going to say certain things, right? Because you know that there's a person on the other end. But when an egg that says that I'm an idiot for not liking a thing or for liking a thing tells me that I'm stupid, like, I'm going to tell that egg to stick it up their egg hole. I don't know. Like, it just, it's so, like, dehumanized that it's easy to just go on there and just say negative things and be negative. But that's why, like, I think that podcasting is a really great thing. And it's different from YouTube. I think the community is pretty different. Cause YouTube is all about monetization and ads and stuff. There's a lot of people doing podcasts who are making no money and they're happy doing that. I would count myself amongst them, even though we make a little bit of revenue now, but, it's certainly not enough to stop doing anything else that I have to do to pay the bills. But like people on podcasts, I think just tend to kind of like, it's gonna sound weird, but kind of like speak their truth, like just kind of talk from the heart, as opposed to the I'm gonna do something for clicks sort of mentality that's generally on YouTube.
Yeah,
I should say that's prevalent on YouTube. It's not like there aren't people on YouTube doing what we do on podcasts, but yeah, it is difficult. I mean, going through the final season of Star Wars Resistance was really hard for me because I realized partway through that season, like, this show's just not made for me. Like, it's made for a different kind of person, and other people really love this show, and I just don't. I'm just really bored by it, and I want it to be the Clone Wars or Star Wars Rebels, and that's not fair because that's not what it's trying to be. It's trying to do something different, and I don't like what it's trying to do. That doesn't mean it's bad, and so it's really hard to then be positive from week to week and find the things that you love about it when it's like, man, if they just did this differently or just tweaked this, it would be the show that I want it to be, right? But it's really hard to let go of that. And I think most people aren't doing the introspection to understand that that's how they feel about something. So, yeah, it's a tough thing to deal with.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, I mean, I've never had a personal Twitter page. And I thought about it briefly. I was like, oh, maybe I should just start my own so that I can, share some of my own stronger opinions without it being attached to the podcast. But I was like, you know what? What's the point? Most of the people, like you said, like people yelling into a void, I don't really care.
Yeah.
And most of the people doing the yelling are to be blunt, kind of the ignorant ones that don't want to have that dialogue. They don't want to have their minds changed, right? And I think you're kind of the same. Like you kind of gave the example of getting that conversation with those, some folks from the Raylo community, right? We're not afraid to admit when we're wrong. We're not afraid to, like I own that all the time about like the first few episodes we did about Last Jedi. I was a bit of a negative Nancy and that's fine. Like it's okay to, I was never toxic, I don't think, but but to anybody who really loved the movie, I don't think I would have wanted to have listened to me talk about it at that time. But I also have loved learning more of its intricacies and learning from the people that have really loved it, who've taught me kind of more about the story, and it's opened my world to, really enjoying it more. And that's kind of the thing with, doing podcasts. I like the way you put it, that you do tend to like reveal more of what's in your heart. And I think a lot of the advantage of that is because you're doing it usually with somebody that very well, right? Mm-hmm. Like Jason and I have been doing the Wampas Lair for over 8 years. We've gotten to know each other very, very well. And it's easier to express exactly what you're feeling because sometimes you forget that you're doing it for an audience even, right? Like Jason and I started the show literally because we just wanted to stay in touch and talk Star Wars. And, we're fortunate enough that other people would even want to listen to that. And I think that's true of a lot of podcasts. And I think when you get people of like minds, sometimes they reveal some ugly things that are in their hearts because there are some podcasters out there that say some pretty messed up things. And it reveals the kind of people they really are. And, so yeah, I don't know. It's just a very interesting medium. Yeah, I don't know. Like this was a complaint I've had about the Disney era of Star Wars, which I don't cling to as much anymore because we're far enough into it that I don't think there's any changing it. But kind of my early complaint, which was like, slow down, right? Yeah. Like pump the brakes, which they've learned their lesson, right? Like they learned that through Solo. They've learned it through other projects. I'm with you. Like I enjoyed the first season of Resistance for the most part. Like I was pleasantly surprised by it. I had no expectations though, so I think that helped. I have not watched one episode of season 2, and honestly, I don't plan on it because like I've just heard how boring it is, and it's just like, oh, I'll rewatch Mandalorian instead, right? Like, and I'm okay with that because I don't think Resistance was made for me, and that's cool. I'm glad they're making it for other people. But the thing that we've kind of been robbed of in the Star Wars Disney era is that opportunity for introspection, right? Like think about growing up with Star Wars in the Lucasfilm era with George Lucas at the helm. And it's not to like deify George. I mean, there's too many people that do that, which I think is also silly. But right, we got a new project every couple of years, and in between those years, you just kind of dived into that, right? And even if it wasn't your favorite, it's kind of all you had. Mm-hmm. So, right, it's like you kind of learn to love it or you just move on. Whereas now it's like, well, I hated that. Well, that's okay because I've got this. And it's like, okay, right? So it doesn't even really warrant you to take the time to be a little more introspective because you know something else is right around the corner that you might get to like more. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I just feel like that's in my own experience. So, and I obviously don't speak for every Star Wars fan at all. We're all so unique in intricate in the way we love Star Wars, but I view it as something very special, and I want the time to really digest it. And as much as I'm going to be the first in line at every single premiere if I can be, right? Whether it's every 3 years or every other month, like I'll be there. But kind of like going to your example earlier of the abusive relationship, right? Like I may not want to be there every month, but I'm gonna be.
Yeah.
So like it's just a funny change of time, right? Like I think Disney in a lot of ways it's a mega corporation. I have a lot of problems with mega corporations because there's no real heart or soul in them. Did Walt Disney start it that way? Probably not. I don't know. George Lucas became a corporate director, but it never lost its heart and soul from things I've heard. So I don't know, it's kind of this different era. And I think episode 9 is kind of a sad casualty of that. Mm-hmm. Insofar as, the biggest flaw of that movie was, I think a lot of people would agree, is that it needed more time to be thought through and written better.
Yeah.
And they didn't give it that time because they had it needs to be done here. This is when it needs to be done. Get it done. Yeah. Right. So how does a creative artist work under that type of pressure? And it's just like, that's a problem.
Yeah. There are so many issues in the Rise of Skywalker screenplay. And what ends up in the movie and it's stuff like it's stupid stuff that bothers me for the most part. It's the dagger, right? Like, yes. Why did Ochi make a dagger specifically that like lines up with it's such a dumb gimmick. Yep. But it's the sort of thing that like when you're in the heat of it and you're trying to problem solve these different pieces of the story and you're already in production and you've got a deadline and you have to get this movie done. You don't have time to stop and go, does that make sense? Does that absolutely, like, what are they going to say? And you don't, because JJ's already on to the next thing, right? He's like, you see him in the documentary, pick it up and he's like, yeah, no, this one could work. And like, they put it up and then they come up with the idea to like have a thing pop out of it and point at it. And it's like, okay, we'll figure out the rest of that later. And then he's like, you could tell he like moved on to another warehouse and was on to the next problem that he had to solve as the director. And, some people are better at doing that than others. Some movies have more time or freedom to problem solve that stuff. A Star Wars movie doesn't and needed more than a year and a half. Because that's what he got. Like he came in late again, just like on The Force Awakens, and had to pull this out of the fire. And now that we've seen that Duel of the Fates screenplay, we kind of know the state that the movie was in going into that decision from Kathleen Kennedy of like, nope, Colin Trevorrow, you're out. You this isn't working. Let's bring JJ back in. It's unfair to judge it in the same way that you judge the other, like the original 3 films, or even especially 1, 2, and 3. Like 1, 2, and 3, like George Lucas just did what he wanted. He had as much time and as much money and resources as he wanted. Like he made the movies he wanted to 100%. Everything he cared about getting on the screen is on the screen. right? Like, he did it. He did his thing. Is that necessarily what everybody wanted from a Star Wars movie? I would argue it's not, but he certainly made the movies that he wanted to make, and then everybody gave him crap for it, and he went, I don't want to make movies anymore. And I don't blame him, because if you did exactly what you wanted to do, and used all of your resources to do it, and then everybody was like, these are poopy, you would be like, cool, well, you guys are poopy, I'm going to sell it. And now we're left with Disney doing it. But people have such a funny, nostalgic, rose-tinted perspective on George Lucas making Star Wars. So when they're like, oh, Clone Wars, it's such a great example. Well, you guys hated George when he said halfway through Clone Wars, yeah, all those books about the Mandalorians, I don't care what's written in any of them. This is what I think Mandalore is. And Karen Travis like lost it online for I think good reason. And they just erased a bunch of books that were canon, and characters that were beloved, and everybody hated George when that happened. But now that we've got either Ryan or JJ to hate, George Lucas is the savior, right? If only George could come back to it. And it's like, really, do you really want? How old? He's got to be in his 70s now, right? Yeah, like. You really want that guy coming back and making a Star Wars movie now? Because I think that he would agree his best years are behind him in terms of filmmaking. He's got other stuff that he wants to do with the time that he's got left. So, and I can't wait for that museum to open up in Los Angeles so that I can see what his passion project has been for the last few years since he sold Star Wars. But for my money, Solo is the best movie since Disney took over, and by all accounts it shouldn't be because of all of the problem that it had in production, but that movie loves Star Wars, and it loves Star Wars fans for loving Star Wars, and I know that because there's a Masters of the Terraskazi reference in the movie, and like that's about as deep as a deep cut gets, and the rest of that movie is just so perfectly made. I love that movie. To me, that's what Star Wars should be going forward. And it's unfortunate that it probably won't be because of how that movie was received. But like, let's get away from the ridiculous having to one up yourself to the point that Palpatine's just shooting lightning into outer space. Cause that's just a bridge too far for me. It just takes me out of the movie. Let's focus on character and let's have a fun adventure, and let's worry less about whether or not the whole galaxy is at stake, and worry about what's at stake for the characters that we love. Right. And that's what Solo does so well. I
mean, yeah, I can't get on board enough with you there. I mean, Solo is my second favorite Star Wars movie. So I loved that movie. I think it's flawless. Yeah. It's so good, and I'd say the same thing is true of Mandalorian. I think Mandalorian has done a phenomenal job of, like that episode I made by myself. I called it "Balancing the Past and the Future," and I would say in the sequel trilogy again, Rian Johnson does the best job of that. JJ is very past oriented, right? Yeah. He's super nostalgia. And there's dude, I mean, I think any Star Wars fan would be a liar if they would say, oh, there's no nostalgia involved in my Star Wars fandom. Hell yeah, there is. And that's good and great. But if that's all it is, I feel like that's not enough. Right. So like, I mean, I know you heard this, but I really stand firmly behind like my thesis about these sequel trilogy writers, which is, JJ was focused on what Star Wars meant to him, and those are the stories he told, right? So that's an angle looking back. He's thinking about all the fun memories he had as a kid, and he wants to tell those stories again. Whereas Ryan, who equally loves Star Wars, I would say just as much as JJ, also said, I love this so much. How can I move it forward? Right. So, and I think those are both fair angles to take. And I think it comes down to which did you prefer? And the funny thing is while I have the most fun with episode 9, I definitely prefer what Last Jedi did to the other two movies by far. And what I would say about, so bringing that back to Mandalorian, I feel like what Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni have done is craft this wonderful story that is something totally new, but is constantly giving homages and nods of respect to what's come before, but never at the expense of the story. Right? Like, you're like, holy shit, did you see that in the background? And it's like, yeah, like somebody who's been a fan of Star Wars for, 25, 35, 40 years, they're going to notice these fun little things that, these guys who have that nostalgia as well kind of slip in there. But it's never like, that's never the main driving force of the story. I feel like, so in Mandalorian, I would say probably the weakest chapter, in my opinion, is chapter 5, going back to Tatooine. Like, I don't think we needed that. Like, I'm not saying I don't like the episode. I thought it was is that chapter 5?
Yeah, that's chapter 5.
Yeah, chapter 5. I thought that was the weakest of the series. That and 6, actually. I thought 5 and 6 were both kind of the weaker ones. My only problem with chapter 6, to be fair, is I can't stand Bill Burr. He does not belong in Star Wars. And same is true of the fat guy with the gray beard. Also an actor that does not belong in Star Wars. They pulled me out of that every time they were on screen.
That's
other
fair.
than that,
I get where you're coming from with that. I like both of them in it, but I get where you're coming from.
I can't stand Bill Burr at all. So just shut up. He's so stupid. So like, his public persona just makes me want to vomit. So seeing him in Star Wars is just annoying. But that being said, chapter 6 is it felt like a great Clone Wars episode.
Yeah, it does. It really does. And it's funny because Matt Lanter's in it. So
yeah. But chapter 5 again is I would say the one that leans most heavily on nostalgia, and I think that's why it's the weakest, because it did the least amount of pushing the story forward. I have a podcast episode that I need you to listen to from What the Force podcast, where they might turn you around on it, because I think that episode actually plays a really, really important role in Din Djarin's journey, and I won't spoil it or anything like that, but I do I think that like there might be a perspective that you're not that didn't click for you, that once you see it you might go, oh, actually that's pretty good. That's a pretty good way to go about it. But I get what you're saying about, like, it wasn't necessary to go back to Tatooine and sort of dig around in the past in that way. But I do like that aspect, because I like to go back to Mos Eisley and see that winning the war didn't necessarily do what we thought it would do, right? That like, there's some parts of the civilized galaxy that I think end up in a better state, but for Tatooine it's actually worse. It's actually like the gangsters don't even care anymore. It's just nobody's around. It's just a ghost town. Like Mos Eisley has just lost what magic it had back in the days of the Empire. So I think that's an interesting perspective, because it kind of puts what the client says into an interesting light when you see that. But yeah. But anyway, I'm going to make this kind of my last point, because it's
getting late. Yeah.
Getting late on the East Coast here. But I think moving forward though, good Star Wars projects will have to really navigate that kind of balancing act, right? Of balancing the nostalgia with also doing something new. And I think that's why I think Mandalorian works so well. I think even Solo works very well in that regard. Right? Like, of course I want a Star Wars story to tap a little bit of my nostalgia. Of course I do. Personally, of course I do. But I also want something new. I want something that, pushes the story forward a bit and makes me think a little bit differently. So yeah, it's a tall order. I don't envy any Star Wars creative writer, to be honest, because the world's also super unforgiving. But I think it can be done. A good buddy of mine made a comment shortly after Rise of Skywalker came out, and he was just like, you know what? Imagine what the sequel trilogy would have been like if they just handed it to Favreau and Filoni to write. I was like, oh, what a great point. Although I don't know that they'd be the two to write those stories, but because because it's pretty clear Favreau just had a fun idea that he wanted to do,
Mm-hmm.
and then Filoni getting attached to it was kind of the perfect medicine. So, not that I am not one of those people that worships Dave Filoni. I think he's an incredibly flawed Star Wars creative, to be honest. I will never be able to forgive World Between Worlds. So that's like the one thing that I always get super bent out of shape about.
Yeah, you don't like that? You don't like Ahsoka escaping death, or just the?
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't like pure fantasy in Star Wars.
Gotcha.
I also don't like Ahsoka escaping death. Yeah. I love Ahsoka, but I really think it would have been important for Vader to kill her. But that's my opinion. It's fine. I love that she's still around, though. That being said, like, I can't wait to see the stories and the adventures we're going to get with her moving forward, because she's one of my favorite Star Wars characters. But yeah, World Between Worlds just I just want to kind of stop respecting Rebels. So it's not.
That's fair.
It's so funny. My comments about Rebels are always the same. It's given me some of my favorites. I mean, Kanan is by far one of my favorite Star Wars characters. Mm-hmm. He's phenomenal, and Hera's right up there as well. And yet it just got it. I don't know. Just as an overall series, it really didn't work for me. So, but that's me, and I love that others have really sunk their teeth into it. But anyway, I've talked enough. I need to go to bed.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on, dude. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you for being on. I'm glad that we could finally connect like this. We need to make sure that it's not so long in between podcasting opportunities. But we'll figure that out. We'll figure it out. Thank you for being on. People should go check out the Wampa's Lair podcast if they want to hear more about what Karl thinks of Star Wars. And I dig in deeper to all of the things that we talked about tonight. I can't recommend it highly enough. I don't listen to very many Star Wars podcasts anymore. And Wampa's Lair is one that I do like check in with you guys on a regular basis, just to kind of see where you're at, because you and Jason always have some good perspectives on Star Wars, and I appreciate that. So it's got my seal of approval. Everybody should go check it out. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back next week, next Wednesday. Obviously, we'll have our regular episode of the ThunderQuack podcast next week, on Patreon on Tuesday, and then the general release next Friday. But we'll have 2 live streams again next week on Wednesday and Friday. So stay tuned for those and to find out who the guests are. I haven't lined anybody up. I've got to figure that out. I'm running out of friends. But I'm sure I'll find somebody, or we'll start cycling some people back in. Man, this whole pandemic thing can't go on for much longer. I don't know how much more I can keep up this streaming schedule, but no, I'm fine. Again, thank you, Karl, for joining me. Thank you to Jason for being in the audience. Jason J. Samuel, one of our Patreon producers, and whoever else was in there. We had a couple other people in there over the course of this conversation. And thank you to everybody who's listening at home on podcast services later. This is Mike from the past saying you in the future, you're pretty cool. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode, and we will catch you guys on the next one.